The howling wind swallowed Frank Miller's gasp as he froze mid-stride on the old railway bridge, his flashlight beam catching the unthinkable. There, on the frost-glazed tracks, lay a German shepherd and three puppies, bound with thick rope, eyes covered with dirty cloth, trembling against each other as the distant train whistle pierced the snowstorm. Not abandoned strays, deliberately placed to die. Martha Wilson's scream from the bridge's edge sliced through the wind, her grocery bags crashing onto the snow-covered planks, canned goods tumbling into darkness below. The mother dog's ears twitched at Frank's approach, her body shifting protectively over her whimpering puppies, despite her restraints, like Eleanor had once shielded their son from the 4th of July fireworks that triggered Frank's war memories. "Jesus Christ," Frank hissed, arthritic fingers fumbling for his pocket knife as the train's headlight cut through the blizzard, painting everything blood red. Who could be so heartless, and why were they made to suffer on the same tracks where Frank had once contemplated ending his own lonely existence? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Oak Ridge, Maine had once been a thriving mill town, but like many small communities across America, it had fallen on hard times. The abandoned paper mill at the edge of town stood as a rusted monument to better days, while the Main Street businesses struggled to keep their lights on. Winter came early this year, harsh and unforgiving, as if to mirror the economic climate. Frank Miller's modest two-bedroom home sat on 3 acres at the outskirts of town, a weathered Cape Cod-style house he'd purchased with Eleanor after his discharge from Vietnam in '72. The white paint had long since faded to a dull gray, matching the overcast skies that seemed permanent fixtures above Oak Ridge. Inside, the house remained frozen in time. Eleanor's quilts still draped over the sofa, her gardening books collecting dust on shelves, the kitchen calendar still showing April 2018, the month she'd passed. At 67, Frank's tall frame had begun to stoop, his once powerful shoulders now hunched from years of carrying invisible burdens. His hands, calloused from decades of carpentry work, now shook slightly from arthritis that worsened with each winter. The VA disability check covered his basic needs, but little else. His silver hair remained military neat, the one habit he couldn't break, though his beard had grown wild since Eleanor's passing. The dining room had been converted to a makeshift bedroom after climbing stairs became too painful for his bad knee, the one that still held shrapnel from Quang Tri. The walls were adorned with fading photographs, Frank in uniform, Eleanor in her nurse's whites, their son Robert's high school graduation. The last picture of all 3 together had been taken 15 years ago, before the argument that had torn father and son apart. Frank told newcomers his son had died in a car accident, easier than explaining the truth of their estrangement. Frank's only regular visitor was Martha Wilson from across the road, a widow herself who brought casseroles on Wednesdays and updates on town gossip he pretended not to care about. They shared coffee on his porch in summer, and by his wood stove in winter, their conversations comfortable in the way only decades of neighboring allows. This morning, before the snowstorm hit, and before his life would change on that railway bridge, Frank had stood at his kitchen window watching cardinals at the bird feeder, Eleanor's birds, she'd called them. The weather report crackled from his old radio, warning of the season's worst blizzard approaching. He'd made his weekly list: pick up prescription refill, get dog food for Martha's aging beagle, check mail at the post office. Simple errands that structured his increasingly empty days. He never expected to return home with 4 new heartbeats under his roof, or that his purposeless existence was about to find meaning in the most unexpected way. He couldn't have known that saving those dogs would ultimately save him too, or that the cruel act of abandonment he'd discovered would unravel secrets long buried in Oak Ridge, secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family, his community, and himself. Frank's ancient pickup truck groaned in protest as he navigated the snow-choked roads back to his house. The mother German shepherd lay across Martha's lap in the passenger seat, her amber eyes never leaving Frank's face, as if assessing whether this human could be trusted. The three puppies, no more than 8 weeks old, huddled together in a cardboard box on the floor, whimpering softly. "You're going to need supplies," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've got some leftover stew meat in my freezer, and blankets. They'll need something warm to sleep on." Frank nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the immediate need to get the dogs to safety. Now, reality was setting in. He hadn't cared for anything living since Eleanor's passing. He could barely care for himself most days. "Should have taken them straight to the shelter," he muttered, though they both knew the small county facility was already overcrowded and underfunded. Martha fixed him with a stern look. "So, they could be put down. Besides, no one's getting to any shelter in this weather." The blizzard was intensifying, thick flakes swirling hypnotically in the headlights. The weatherman had predicted 2 feet by morning, with another system close behind. The truck's heater wheezed lukewarm air into the cab, barely cutting the chill. "The poor things," Martha continued, gently stroking the mother dog's head. "Look at these scars, Frank. Someone's been cruel to her." Frank's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where the dog's reflection showed a jagged scar running along her back, partially hidden by her dark fur. "There's a special place in hell for whoever did this," he said quietly. By the time they reached Frank's driveway, the snow was almost to his knees. He carried the box of puppies while Martha guided the mother dog, who limped noticeably on her right front paw. Inside, Frank hurriedly built a fire in the wood stove while Martha arranged blankets in the corner of the living room. "She needs a name," Martha said, watching the German shepherd cautiously explore the perimeter of the room, checking on her puppies between each circuit. Frank considered the dog's dark coat and watchful demeanor. "Shadow," he decided. "She looks like a shadow." The puppies, 2 males and a female, were a blur of fuzzy ears and uncoordinated paws once released from the box. The largest, a dark-coated male with a white chest patch, immediately began investigating everything within reach. His brother, the smallest of the litter with lighter coloring, seemed content to stay close to their mother. The female puppy, with mixed coloring and bright eyes, positioned herself between her siblings and these strange humans, tiny but protective. "That one's got your disposition," Martha chuckled, pointing to the female puppy. "Suspicious of everyone." Frank harumphed, but couldn't help the slight smile tugging at his mouth. "I've earned my suspicions." Martha left and returned an hour later with supplies: dog food, bowls, an old baby gate, and frozen stew meat that she immediately set to thawing. "I've called Dr. Thompson," she informed him. "She can't get here tonight with the roads, but she'll come first thing tomorrow to check them over." Frank nodded his thanks, uncomfortable with how quickly his solitary life was being rearranged. Shadow had finally settled on the blankets, her puppies nursing as she kept her eyes trained on Frank's movements. That night, Frank slept fitfully in his recliner rather than his bed, unwilling to leave the dogs alone in an unfamiliar place. Each time he woke, he found Shadow watching him, her gaze neither friendly nor hostile, simply assessing. Around 3 a.m. he was startled awake by whimpering. The smallest puppy was struggling to breathe, his tiny chest heaving with the effort. Frank knelt beside the blankets, heart pounding, unsure what to do. Shadow nudged her struggling pup gently with her nose, then looked up at Frank as if asking for help. "I don't know what to do, girl," he whispered, panic rising. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call Martha. To his surprise, Shadow gently took his wrist in her mouth, not biting, just holding, and guided his hand to her puppy. Frank carefully lifted the tiny dog, noting how light he felt, how rapid his heartbeat was against his palm. Remembering something Eleanor had once done for a neighbor's choking child, Frank gently turned the puppy over and patted his back. After a tense moment, the puppy coughed, expelling a small amount of fluid, and his breathing eased. "Good boy," Frank murmured, relief washing over him. He settled back in his chair with the puppy on his chest, his weathered hand covering the tiny body. "We'll call you Scout. Always the ones who need the most help that fight the hardest." By morning, the storm had intensified as predicted. Frank's driveway had disappeared under a blanket of white, and the wind howled around the eaves of the old house. He made coffee and scrambled eggs, setting aside a portion for Shadow, who accepted the offering with cautious dignity. At precisely 9 a.m. there was a knock at the door. Dr. Sarah Thompson stood on his porch, snow covering her parka, an oversized medical bag in her gloved hands. In her late 30s, with practical short brown hair and no-nonsense glasses, she had the competent air of someone used to handling emergencies. "Martha called. Said you got some patients for me?" she said, stomping snow from her boots. Frank led her to the living room, where Shadow immediately positioned herself between the vet and her puppies. "Doctor." Thompson knelt at a respectful distance, allowing the mother dog to sniff her hands before attempting any examination. "She's been abused," the vet said after a thorough check. "These scars are deliberate, not accidental. And look here." She pointed to a small raised area on Shadow's neck. "I think there's something embedded under the skin. Might be a microchip." Frank's brow furrowed. "Can you tell who she is?" Dr. Thompson shook her head. "Need a scanner for that. I've got one at the clinic." She examined each puppy next, her expression growing more concerned as she checked Scout. "This little one has a heart murmur and possibly pneumonia starting. He needs antibiotics." Frank nodded, not asking about costs. "Whatever he needs." After administering initial treatments and leaving medicines with detailed instructions, Dr. Thompson paused at the door. "Mr. Miller, whoever left these dogs on those tracks, it wasn't random. The rope, the blindfolds, that's deliberate cruelty. I'm going to report this to Sheriff Hayes." Frank nodded grimly. "Appreciate that. And call me Frank." After she left, he stood at the window watching the relentless snowfall, a strange unease settling over him. Shadow appeared at his side, her posture alert, a low growl rumbling in her chest as she stared out at the white landscape. "See something, girl?" Frank asked, peering into the swirling snow. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed a dark figure at the edge of his property, but it vanished so quickly he couldn't be sure it wasn't a trick of the storm. Shadow's continued growling, however, suggested otherwise. That afternoon, while the puppies napped, Frank examined Shadow more carefully. Beyond the prominent scar on her back, he found other marks. Small circular burns on her legs that looked like cigarette marks, a notch missing from one ear, and most disturbing, what appeared to be surgical scars on her abdomen that were too precise to be from street fights or accidents. "What happened to you?" he murmured, gently running his hand along her side. Shadow leaned against his touch, the first voluntary contact she had initiated, before returning to her puppies. As darkness fell, Frank's phone rang. It was Sheriff Thomas Hayes, his gravelly voice almost lost in static from the poor connection. "Frank, it's Tom. Just got a report from Dr. Thompson about those dogs you found. Strange timing, we've had reports of a black van with out-of-state plates asking questions around town yesterday. Description matches one reported near animal abuse cases in New Hampshire last month." Frank's eyes drifted to Shadow, who had raised her head at the sound of the sheriff's voice through the phone. "Any leads?" "Not yet. Storm's got us all hands on deck with accidents and power outages. But I wanted to warn you. Whoever did this might come looking. Keep your doors locked." After hanging up, Frank checked his windows and doors, then retrieved the shotgun from his bedroom closet. He hadn't fired it since last hunting season, but the familiar weight was reassuring as he loaded it and placed it within reach of his recliner. That night, as the storm reached its peak, Frank was awakened from a doze by Shadow's urgent bark. The mother dog stood rigid by the front window, hackles raised. Outside, through the curtain of blowing snow, the beam of a flashlight swept across his front yard. Frank moved silently to the window, decades of military training returning instinctively. The flashlight beam bobbed through the snowstorm, its owner struggling against the wind. Beside him, Shadow's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Frank reached for his shotgun, but paused when the porch light illuminated a familiar uniform. Sheriff Hayes stomped up the steps, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, his weathered face grim beneath his department-issued hat. Frank opened the door before he could knock. "Tom, what brings you out in this hellstorm?" The sheriff's breath clouded in the frigid air. "Found something you need to see." He held up an evidence bag containing a torn piece of paper. "This was nailed to the railroad crossing sign near where you found those dogs." Frank ushered him inside where Shadow had positioned herself between the intruder and her sleeping puppies. The sheriff nodded respectfully at the dog. "She's protective." "Good sign." Under the kitchen light, Frank examined the paper through the plastic. The message was typed, "Return property or face consequences." "Property?" Frank's voice hardened. "They're calling these dogs property?" Sheriff Hayes removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "There's more. Dr. Thompson called." She scanned the mother dog's chip. "It's military grade, Frank, not your standard pet microchip." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Military? You saying Shadow's a service dog?" "K-9 unit, most likely. Thompson says the chip has partial ID numbers that match military formats. She's making inquiries." The sheriff hesitated. "Thing is, there's no official record of missing military dogs in the system. I checked." Frank glanced at Shadow, who had relaxed slightly but remained vigilant. "Black Ops? Maybe, or something less official." Hayes lowered his voice. "Remember Richard Montgomery?" Frank's jaw tightened. Richard Montgomery was Oak Ridge's wealthiest resident, a retired defense contractor who'd bought the old Prescott estate 5 years ago. His donations had kept the town library open and funded the new wing at the medical center. He also owned the abandoned mill property and several hundred acres surrounding Oak Ridge. What's Montgomery got to do with this? His company, Northland Security, had government contracts training specialized dogs for overseas deployment. Program officially ended 2 years ago, but... Hayes shrugged. Rumors say some work continued privately. Frank processed this information, memories of his own military service surfacing, the things that happened off the books, the deniable operations. "You think Montgomery's involved in whatever happened to Shadow?" "I'm not saying anything official." Hayes glanced at the dog. "But his estate manager, Jenkins, was asking about missing dogs at the diner yesterday morning." "Before you found them." The implications hung in the air between them. Frank's hands curled into fists. "If Montgomery's responsible for this..." "Careful, Frank." Hayes held up a calming hand. "Montgomery employs half the town since the mill closed. He's got the mayor and town council in his pocket. We need evidence before making accusations." After the sheriff left, Frank sat beside Shadow, gently examining the area where Dr. Thompson had found the chip. The dog allowed his touch, her intelligent eyes watching him. "What were they using you for, girl?" he murmured. Shadow's ears perked up at his voice, her head tilting slightly as if trying to understand. Frank was startled by a knock at the back door. Martha stood on his porch, clutching her coat around her. "Saw the sheriff's car," she said by way of explanation. "Everything all right?" He ushered her in and recounted the sheriff's visit while Martha made fresh coffee. Her normally cheerful face grew troubled. "Montgomery's bad news, Frank," she said quietly. "Eleanor thought so, too." Frank's head snapped up. "Eleanor? What did she have to do with Montgomery?" Martha looked uncomfortable. "She didn't tell you? She volunteered at the medical center after she retired, said she saw things in Montgomery's wing she didn't like, procedures on animals. She was filing some kind of report when—" Martha stopped abruptly. "When what?" Frank demanded, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. "When she had her accident," Martha finished, not meeting his eyes. Frank sat heavily in his kitchen chair. Eleanor's death had been ruled an accident. Her car had skidded off the river road during a rainstorm. He'd been too consumed by grief to question the details. "Are you saying her accident wasn't an accident?" Martha fidgeted with her coffee cup. "I'm not saying anything, Frank. Just that Eleanor was troubled about something she saw." And a week later, she was gone. The following morning, Frank awoke to find Scout wheezing again. The smallest puppy lay limp in his blanket, his tiny chest struggling for each breath. Frank called Dr. Thompson, who arrived within the hour, despite the still treacherous roads. "Pneumonia's worse," she confirmed after examination. "He needs stronger antibiotics and possibly oxygen. I should take him to the clinic." Frank hesitated, looking at Shadow. The mother dog's eyes were filled with what could only be described as worry. "Will he make it?" Dr. Thompson's professional demeanor softened. "I'll do everything I can, Mr. Miller. But he's very weak." As she prepared to leave with Scout, Frank made a decision. "I'm coming too. Shadow as well. The other puppies, Martha will watch them," Frank said, already reaching for his coat. "Shadow won't let her pup go alone. Neither will I." The drive to the clinic was tense, with Scout's breathing growing more labored. Frank sat in the back seat with Shadow, the dog's head resting on his knee as she watched her puppy in the special carrier Dr. Thompson had brought. The veterinary clinic was a small but modern facility on the edge of town. Dr. Thompson ushered them through the back entrance, quickly setting up an oxygen tent for Scout while explaining the treatment plan. Frank nodded, not asking about costs that he knew would strain his fixed income. While Scout received treatment, Dr. Thompson took Shadow to another room to properly scan her chip. Frank paced the waiting area, his mind churning with what Martha had revealed about Eleanor's concerns. When Dr. Thompson returned, her expression was grave. "The chip confirms it. Shadow was part of a military K-9 program. But there's something else." She showed Frank her tablet screen displaying the scan results. "This secondary chip wasn't installed by military personnel. It's aftermarket, and it contains tracking data." Frank's blood ran cold. "They can track her?" "Not anymore. I've disabled it. But yes, someone was monitoring her movements." Dr. Thompson hesitated. "There's more. I found surgical alterations consistent with experimental procedures, nothing that harmed her functionality, but definitely not standard military training." "Experiments? What kind?" "It's hard to say without more information, but based on these scan results and her physical condition, I'd guess behavioral modification, sensory enhancement training, possibly pain response testing." Her voice became clinical, masking anger. "The scars you found are consistent with controlled testing environments, not abuse from neglect." Frank stroked Shadow's head, rage building inside him. "Someone did this to her deliberately. For what? To make a better attack dog?" "I don't know, but—" Dr. Thompson was interrupted by the clinic door opening. A tall man in an expensive overcoat entered, flanked by a younger assistant clutching a tablet. Despite being in his mid-60s, Richard Montgomery carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his tanned face suggesting recent travel to warmer climates. "Dr. Thompson," he greeted warmly, though his eyes were cold. "I heard you might have found one of our missing research animals." Shadow's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her hackles raised, a deep growl emanating from her throat as she positioned herself in front of Frank. Her behavior was not aggressive but distinctly protective. Dr. Thompson stepped forward professionally. "Mr. Montgomery, I wasn't aware you were involved in animal research." "A small private study on service animals for veterans," Montgomery replied smoothly. "Very humanitarian. That shepherd and her litter went missing during transport last week." "We've been quite concerned." Frank stood, placing a steadying hand on Shadow's back. "Funny way to transport animals. Tied up on railroad tracks during a blizzard." Montgomery's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Miller. Frank Miller." A flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossed Montgomery's face before disappearing. "Mr. Miller, our transport vehicle was hijacked outside Portland. Clearly, whoever took our animals abandoned them when the storm hit. A terrible crime." "Then you won't mind providing the police report number," Dr. Thompson interjected, "for a hijacking involving valuable research animals." Montgomery's assistant stepped forward. "We have all the documentation here, including ownership papers." He held out a folder. "We're prepared to compensate Mr. Miller for finding them, of course." Frank felt Shadow pressing against his leg, her body trembling slightly, not with fear, he realized, but with tension, as if preparing to defend him. "These dogs were abused," Frank stated flatly. "Experimented on. Shadow has scars all over her body." "Shadow." Montgomery raised an eyebrow. "Her designation is K9 217, and any marks you've observed are standard from her training regimen. Now, if you'll just sign these release forms." The clinic's back door opened, and a uniformed police officer entered. Frank turned, expecting Sheriff Hayes, but instead found himself looking at a younger officer with familiar eyes he hadn't seen in 15 years. "Robert?" Frank whispered, shock rendering him momentarily speechless. The officer stiffened, clearly as surprised as Frank. "It's Michael now. Michael Davis." He looked from Frank to Montgomery, confusion evident. "Sheriff Hayes sent me to check on the situation with the recovered dogs." The room fell silent as Frank stared at his son. The son he'd believed dead, or at least gone forever. The son whose bedroom remained untouched upstairs, whose photographs Frank still spoke to on lonely nights. "You're alive," Frank managed finally, his voice barely audible. Officer Davis, Robert, looked uncomfortable. "Sheriff Hayes didn't tell me you were involved, Mr. Miller." The formal address cut through Frank like a knife. His son was calling him Mr. Miller, as if they were strangers. Montgomery cleared his throat. "Officer Davis, perfect timing. We're just completing paperwork to recover our missing research animals. Mr. Miller here found them, and has been temporarily sheltering them." Michael looked between Montgomery and his father, professional mask slipping momentarily. "These are your dogs, Mr. Montgomery?" "Legally, yes. We have all documentation." Dr. Thompson intervened. "The mother dog has evidence of experimental procedures not consistent with ethical animal treatment, and they were found deliberately placed on active train tracks." Michael's expression hardened. "That's a serious allegation, Doctor. Do you have evidence connecting Mr. Montgomery to that act?" Before she could answer, a monitor beeped urgently from the treatment room. Dr. Thompson rushed to check on Scout, leaving Frank facing his son and Montgomery in tense silence. The stress of the confrontation, combined with the shock of seeing his son alive, proved too much for Frank's weak heart. A crushing pain radiated across his chest, his vision blurring at the edges. He staggered, reaching for support. Shadow barked sharply, pushing against Frank's legs as he started to collapse. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was his son's face, older, changed, but unmistakably Robert, showing the first genuine emotion he'd seen: fear. Frank awoke to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the antiseptic smell of hospital sheets. His vision cleared slowly, revealing the sterile white ceiling of Oak Ridge Regional Medical Center. A slight pressure on his left hand drew his attention. Shadow lay beside his bed, her muzzle resting gently on his fingers, amber eyes watching him intently. "She wouldn't leave," came a voice from the doorway. Dr. Thompson stood there, clipboard in hand, her white coat exchanged for a thick sweater. They tried to remove her twice. The second time she growled at the orderly. "I had to convince Administrator Wilson to make an exception." Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. "Scout. Stable for now. He's fighting." She approached, checking the monitors. "Just like you. You had a mild heart attack, Mr. Miller. Your arteries are more blocked than we'd like." Frank nodded absently, the memory of his son's face flooding back. "Robert, Officer Davis brought you in," she confirmed. "He's been by twice to check on you. Didn't stay long." The door opened again, and Martha bustled in carrying a small cooler. "Thank the Lord!" she exclaimed upon seeing Frank awake. "You gave us all a scare." She set down her burden and took his free hand, the one not occupied by Shadow. "I've brought some real food. That hospital slop won't help anyone recover." Frank managed a weak smile, grateful for Martha's practical affection. "The puppies? Safe at my place. That sweet girl Ranger is a handful, though, and ladies figured out how to open the baby gate." She glanced at Shadow. "This one wouldn't budge from your side. Growled at anyone who tried to separate you. Doctor, Thompson had to threaten the hospital with some law about service animals." Dr. Thompson smiled. "Not exactly legal, but they don't know that." A nurse entered with medication, eyeing Shadow warily. The dog didn't move, but tracked the woman's every movement as she adjusted Frank's IV. "The news is all over town," Martha continued once the nurse left. "Front page of the Oak Ridge Gazette. Local man rescues abandoned dogs. Collapses during confrontation with Montgomery." Frank grimaced. "That'll make me popular." "You'd be surprised," Dr. Thompson interjected. "Montgomery isn't as beloved as he thinks. People have been bringing food to my clinic for Shadow and the puppies. Mrs. Peterson from the diner set up a donation jar for Scout's medical bills. It's already got over $400. Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. In a town where most people lived paycheck to paycheck, that kind of generosity was significant. "And there's more," Martha added, lowering her voice conspiratorially. 3 other families have come forward saying their dogs disappeared in the last year. All German shepherds or similar breeds." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Hayes entered, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Good to see you awake, Frank." He nodded to the women. "Ladies, could I have a moment with our patient?" Once alone, except for Shadow, who refused to leave, Hayes pulled a chair close to the bed. "We've got problems, Frank. Montgomery's filed a formal claim for the dogs. Says they're part of a private research program for developing better service animals for veterans." Frank's jaw tightened. "And you believe that horse shit?" "What I believe doesn't matter. He's got paperwork, Frank. Looks legitimate. Those dogs were left to die on train tracks. You think that's standard transport procedure?" Hayes sighed heavily. "Montgomery's saying a disgruntled ex-employee stole the dogs during transport. He's filed charges against person or persons unknown." Frank struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in his chest. "Tom, you know that's a cover-up. Shadow's been abused, experimented on. Dr. Thompson has evidence. Evidence that shows unusual procedures, yes. Not evidence that links it directly to Montgomery." Hayes leaned closer. "Frank, I've known you 40 years, I believe you. But Montgomery's got the mayor, the town council, and half the business owners in his pocket since he started buying up property. We need more than suspicions. Frank slumped back against his pillows, frustration evident. What about Robert? He saw everything at the clinic. Hayes hesitated. Michael, as he calls himself now, is in a difficult position. He's a good officer, but he's new to the force, still on probation. He paused. Frank, why didn't you tell me your son was alive? Because I thought he was dead, Frank answered flatly. After our fight, he said he never wanted to see me again. Changed his name, apparently. When I couldn't find him after years of searching, I just started telling people he'd died. Easier than explaining the truth. Hayes absorbed this with a nod. Well, he's requested to be removed from any case involving you, citing personal conflict. The news stung, but Frank wasn't surprised. He hates me that much? Didn't say hate, said complicated history. Hayes stood. Rest up, Frank, and watch your back. Montgomery doesn't like loose ends. After Hayes left, Frank lay back, his mind racing despite his physical exhaustion. Shadow shifted, resting her head on his chest, the warm weight somehow comforting against the ache in his heart. "What did you see, girl?" he whispered. "What did Eleanor see?" The next morning, Frank was surprised by a visitor. Michael Davis, the son he'd known as Robert, stood awkwardly in the doorway, still in uniform but clearly off duty. Shadow raised her head but didn't growl, merely watching with that same intelligent assessment she'd shown since Frank first found her. "Can I come in?" Michael asked stiffly. Frank nodded, his throat suddenly tight. His son had changed in 15 years. Broader in the shoulders, lines around his eyes, a military precise haircut that reminded Frank of his own younger days. But those eyes, Eleanor's eyes, were unchanged. Michael remained standing, maintaining a careful distance. "Doctor says you're stable. That's good." Frank nodded again, unsure what to say to this stranger who was his flesh and blood. "I didn't know you were still in Oak Ridge," Michael finally said. "When I took the job, they told me Frank Miller was an elderly widower. Common enough name, I didn't make the connection." "When did you come back?" 6 months ago, after my divorce." Michael's gaze drifted to Shadow. "That dog really attached to you." Frank ran a hand along Shadow's back. "She's been through a lot. We understand each other." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "I have a daughter," Michael said suddenly. "Emma. She's 7. The news hit Frank like a physical blow. A granddaughter. 7 years old, and he'd never known she existed. "She looks like Mom," Michael added, almost reluctantly. "Same smile." Frank swallowed hard. "I'd like to meet her someday." "Maybe." Michael shifted his weight. "Look, about Montgomery." Frank tensed. "What about him?" "Be careful. He's not someone you want as an enemy." Michael's professional demeanor slipped, revealing genuine concern. "The department's divided. Some officers think the dogs are just property, a civil matter at most. Others—" he hesitated. "Others have heard rumors about what goes on at his research facility outside town." "What kind of rumors?" "Nothing specific enough to get a warrant. Just whispers from delivery drivers, maintenance workers. Strange sounds at night. Areas no one's allowed to enter." Michael straightened. "I can't be officially involved, but Sheriff Hayes is a good man. Trust him." As Michael turned to leave, Frank called out, "Your mother would be proud." "Of you becoming an officer." His son paused in the doorway, not turning around. "I'm having dinner with Emma tonight. She's been asking about her grandfather." He glanced back. "I told her he was a hero in Vietnam." After Michael left, Frank lay back, overwhelmed by emotion. Shadow nudged his hand with her nose, her eyes somehow understanding. Dr. Thompson returned later that afternoon with news about Scout. "He's responding to the antibiotics, heart stronger. If he continues improving, you can take him home in a couple of days." "And me?" "At least 3 more days observation. Your heart needs rest." She hesitated. "Mr. Miller, there's something else you should know. I've been examining Shadow's blood work more carefully. She shows markers consistent with specialized training for medical detection." Frank frowned. "Medical detection?" "Some dogs can be trained to detect cancer, seizures, even diabetic episodes before they happen. Shadow's responses suggest similar training, but more advanced." Dr. Thompson lowered her voice. "The day you collapsed, she was alerting. She knew something was wrong with your heart before you did." Frank looked at Shadow with newfound appreciation. The dog met his gaze steadily. "There's more," Dr. Thompson continued. "I've done some research on Montgomery's company. Northland Security had a subsidiary called BioSense Innovations that was working on medical detection dogs for the military, not just for finding wounded soldiers, but for detecting biological threats." "Is that legal?" "The research itself, yes, but using inhumane methods, pushing animals beyond ethical limits, no." She grimaced. "The program was officially shut down 2 years ago after a congressional inquiry, but Montgomery might have continued privately," Frank finished. "Exactly. And Frank," Dr. Thompson hesitated, "the timing of the program's closure coincides with when your wife died." The implication hung in the air. Frank recalled Martha's words about Eleanor's concerns over procedures she'd witnessed. His grief, which had dulled to a persistent ache over 5 years, suddenly sharpened into something more dangerous: suspicion. That evening, a nurse brought in a small television for Frank's room, mentioning that his story was on the local news. Sure enough, the 6 o'clock broadcast featured a reporter standing in front of the veterinary clinic. "The story of one man's rescue of abandoned dogs has captivated Oak Ridge," the reporter announced. "Frank Miller, a Vietnam veteran, discovered a mother German Shepherd and her puppies deliberately tied to railroad tracks during last week's blizzard. Miller suffered a heart attack after confronting businessman Richard Montgomery, who claims the dogs belong to his research facility." The camera cut to Montgomery standing in front of his impressive estate. "While we appreciate Mr. Miller's concern, these animals are specialized service dogs in training to help veterans with PTSD, a cause I would think Mr. Miller, as a veteran himself, would support. We look forward to their safe return so they can continue their important work." Frank snorted in disgust. The report continued with community reaction, showing the donation jar at Peterson's Diner overflowing with bills and coins. Several townspeople expressed support for Frank, though others noted Montgomery's contributions to the town's economy. Most surprising was a brief statement from Michael, identified only as Officer Davis. Standing in front of the police station, he stated professionally, "The Oak Ridge Police Department is investigating all aspects of this case, including how the animals came to be abandoned on the tracks. We take animal cruelty very seriously in this jurisdiction." Though his words were carefully neutral, Frank detected an undercurrent of defiance. His son was making a public statement that the police wouldn't simply accept Montgomery's version of events. The news shifted to the weather forecast, another storm system approaching, when Frank's attention was drawn to Shadow. The dog had moved to the window, her posture alert, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Frank reached for the call button, suddenly uneasy. Before he could press it, the room's lights flickered and went out, plunging the space into darkness. The emergency lighting kicked on seconds later, casting eerie shadows. A hospital-wide announcement reported a generator malfunction affecting the east wing, exactly where Frank's room was located. Shadow's growl deepened, her focus fixed on the door. The handle turned slowly, and a figure slipped inside, not a nurse or doctor, but a man in dark clothing with a hospital maintenance badge. Shadow placed herself between Frank and the intruder, her warning growl now unmistakable. The man froze, clearly not expecting the dog's presence. In his hand was a syringe. "Hospital sent you for a blood draw?" Frank asked calmly, reaching for the emergency call button beside his bed. The intruder lunged forward, but Shadow was faster. She didn't bite, but body blocked the man with enough force to send him staggering back against the wall. The syringe clattered to the floor. Frank pressed the call button repeatedly as the man recovered his balance and reached inside his jacket. Shadow's bark was deafening in the small room, alerting the entire floor to trouble. The door burst open again and Michael rushed in, off duty but still wearing his sidearm. He assessed the situation in an instant, drawing his weapon and ordering the intruder to freeze. The man made a desperate move toward the window, but Michael tackled him efficiently, securing his hands behind his back with practiced ease. Shadow maintained her protective stance beside Frank's bed, only relaxing slightly when Martha and Dr. Thompson appeared in the doorway. "Dad! Are you all right?" Michael asked urgently, the familial term slipping out unintentionally in the heat of the moment. Frank nodded, more affected by his son calling him Dad than by the attempted attack. Shadow knew something was wrong. She was ready when he came in. As hospital security arrived to take custody of the intruder, Michael examined the dropped syringe. "This isn't hospital issue. We'll test the contents." His professional demeanor had returned, but something had shifted between father and son. "He works for Montgomery," Frank stated with certainty. "We don't know that yet," Michael replied carefully, though his expression suggested he shared the suspicion. Dr. Thompson checked Frank's vitals, concerned about the effect of stress on his heart. "Your pulse is elevated but steady. Still, we should move you to another room." As they prepared for the transfer, Martha picked up a small object from the floor, a thumb drive that must have fallen from the intruder's pocket during the struggle. She quietly slipped it into her sweater pocket, catching Frank's eye with a meaningful look. That night, in a new room with a hospital security guard posted outside, Frank finally allowed himself to process what had happened. Shadow lay across the foot of his bed, authorized now as an unofficial therapy dog thanks to Dr. Thompson's insistence. "You saved my life," Frank told her quietly, scratching behind her ears. "Twice now." Shadow's tail thumped against the blanket, her intelligent eyes fixed on him with what seemed like genuine affection. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Frank felt the hollow space in his chest begin to fill with something besides grief. Purpose. Outside, the promised storm arrived, snow swirling against the window as wind howled around the hospital. But inside, Frank Miller made a silent vow. He would protect Shadow and her puppies, uncover whatever Montgomery was hiding, and maybe, just maybe, find a way back to the son he'd thought was lost forever. The blizzard intensified overnight, transforming Oak Ridge into a snow-globed town cut off from the outside world. Power lines sagged under the weight of ice, roads disappeared beneath 4-foot drifts, and the hospital switched to emergency generators as the main electrical grid failed. Frank stood at his room window watching ambulance crews struggle to clear the emergency entrance below, their movement slow and deliberate in the Arctic conditions. "They're saying it's the worst storm in 30 years, Martha announced, entering with a thermos of homemade soup. She'd somehow convinced the hospital staff to let her bring outside food, likely through the same force of personality that had kept her checking on Frank daily despite the weather. "Town's declaring a state of emergency. National Guard might come once the interstate's passable." Frank nodded absently, his mind on more immediate concerns. "Any news about the man who tried to attack me?" Martha lowered her voice, though they were alone. "Sheriff Hayes has him in custody, but he's not talking. No ID on him either, just a fake hospital badge." "And the thumb drive you found?" Martha patted her pocket. "Brought my laptop. Thought we could take a look together." They huddled at the small hospital table as Martha inserted the drive into her computer. the screen filled with files, technical documents, spreadsheets, and photographs. "These are research records," Martha whispered, clicking through documents labeled with alphanumeric codes. "Medical trials, behavioral conditioning protocols, performance metrics." She opened a folder labeled K9 to 217 and gasped. Shadow's face stared back at them from a clinical photograph. The image showed her strapped to an examination table, electrodes attached to her head and torso. Additional photos documented surgical procedures, training exercises involving pain response, and behavioral tests. "My God," Frank breathed, rage building as he scrolled through the evidence of systematic torture disguised as research. They were conditioning her to respond to specific stimuli, training her to detect certain compounds even under extreme stress. Martha, who'd worked as a nurse before retirement, pointed to a section of text. "Look at this. They were using some kind of experimental compound to enhance her natural abilities, testing her sensory responses against control groups." Her finger traced along a chart. Shadow was their star subject. Her detection accuracy was nearly perfect, even after sleep deprivation and stress induction. Frank felt physically ill. They tortured her to make her a better detector dog. But detector for what? Martha opened another file, this one containing video clips. The first showed Shadow in a sterile white room approaching various containers. She sat promptly beside one, receiving a reward. The next clip showed a similar test, but this time a shock collar activated when she hesitated. The third clip made Frank slam the laptop shut, Shadow being forced to continue detection exercises while clearly injured, her leg bandaged and bleeding. "We need to get this to Sheriff Hayes," Frank said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "There's something else," Martha said hesitantly. "I found a file with your wife's name." Frank froze. "What?" Martha reopened the laptop, navigating to a folder labeled Personnel Incidents. Inside was a subfolder. E. Miller, terminated. With trembling fingers, Frank clicked it open. A single document appeared. A security report dated 3 days before Eleanor's fatal accident. It detailed her unauthorized access to research files, her formal complaint to the hospital ethics board, and a recommendation for immediate resolution of security breach. The final line read, "Subject continues to present unacceptable risk to Project Sentinel. Recommend immediate termination and containment of all related materials." Frank stared at the screen, the world narrowing to those damning words. All these years, he'd believed Eleanor's death was a tragic accident, her car skidding off the river road during a rainstorm. The sheriff had told him she likely died on impact. The car submerged for hours before a passing motorist noticed the broken guardrail. "They killed her," he whispered, the truth crystallizing with terrible clarity. "She discovered what they were doing to these dogs, tried to report it, and they killed her." Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Frank, we need to be careful. If Montgomery discovers we have this—" "I don't care," Frank interrupted, a cold resolve replacing his shock. "Eleanor tried to stop them, and they silenced her. I won't let them do the same to Shadow or her puppies." At that moment, Shadow raised her head from where she'd been resting on Frank's bed, her ears perking forward. Seconds later, Dr. Thompson entered, her expression grave. "We have a problem," she announced without preamble. "Scout's condition is deteriorating. His oxygen levels are dropping despite the antibiotics, and his heart rate is becoming erratic." Frank straightened. "What does he need?" "Specialized pediatric respiratory equipment the clinic doesn't have. In normal circumstances, I'd transfer him to Portland Animal Hospital, but with the roads—" She gestured helplessly toward the window where the blizzard continued unabated. "What about here? The hospital must have respiratory equipment." Dr. Thompson nodded reluctantly. "They do, but Administrator Wilson has refused my request to use it for a dog. Says it can't be spared from potential human needs during the storm emergency." Frank's jaw set stubbornly. "Wilson? That's Montgomery's man. He donated the entire East Wing." "Exactly. And with Montgomery claiming ownership of Shadow and her puppies—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Frank made a quick decision. "Bring Scout here to my room." Frank, the administrator, specifically prohibited— "I don't give a damn what he prohibited. That puppy is not dying because of some bureaucratic bullshit." Frank turned to Martha. "Your son-in-law still work in respiratory therapy here?" Martha nodded. "James, he's on duty today." "Good. Tell him we need his help." Off the books. As Martha hurried out, Frank explained to Dr. Thompson about the thumb drive and its contents. Her professional composure cracked as he described the experiments. "That's not research. It's torture," she said, examining the files with growing horror. "And these medications they were using on Shadow, they're experimental compounds that haven't been approved for animal use. The side effects alone could cause permanent damage." Frank thought about Shadow's protectiveness, her unusual intelligence, her ability to detect his heart condition before it became critical. Could these enhancements be why she's so attuned to health issues? Dr. Thompson frowned. Possibly. German Shepherds naturally have about 225 million scent receptors, compared to our mere 5 million. With specialized training and these compounds— She shook her head. "They essentially created a four-legged medical diagnostic tool at the cost of Shadow's well-being." An hour later, Martha returned with James, a burly man in hospital scrubs who wheeled in respiratory equipment under the guise of bringing it for routine maintenance. Behind them came Michael, carrying a pet carrier containing Scout. The puppy's breathing was labored, his tiny body fighting for each breath. "Dad," Michael acknowledged Frank with a nod, the familial term no longer seeming accidental. "Martha filled me in. What you're doing could get all of you fired." He looked pointedly at James, who was already setting up the equipment. "Then why are you here?" Frank challenged. Michael's expression hardened. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I've seen enough evidence to know Montgomery isn't who he pretends to be." As James and Dr. Thompson worked to stabilize Scout, connecting him to the oxygen supply and monitoring equipment, Michael pulled Frank aside. "The man who attacked you, Jenkins, worked security at Montgomery's research facility," he said quietly. "We found a burner phone in his possession with only one contact. Traced it to Montgomery's estate manager." Frank wasn't surprised. "Have you seen the files on the thumb drive?" "Martha showed me. It's disturbing, but not enough for an arrest warrant. Most judges would see it as proprietary research data, not evidence of a crime." Michael hesitated. "The document about Mom, though, that's different. If we can prove Montgomery was involved in her death—" "I know he was," Frank said with certainty. "Eleanor wouldn't have just stumbled onto their program. She was volunteering in the very wing Montgomery funded. She saw something, threatened to expose it, and paid with her life." Michael's professional facade cracked slightly, grief and anger bleeding through. "I've requested her accident report from storage. Sheriff Hayes is helping me access sealed records from the investigation. If there's evidence of foul play—" "There won't be," Frank interrupted. "They would have covered their tracks." "Made it look like an accident. Then we need more recent evidence connecting Montgomery to criminal activity." Michael glanced at the equipment now helping Scout breathe. "This, using hospital resources for personal use, isn't enough. What about the attack on me? The fact that Shadow and her puppies were left to die on those tracks? Jenkins isn't talking, and without witnesses to who placed the dogs on the tracks." Michael shook his head. "We need more." Across the room, Scout's condition appeared to be stabilizing under James and Dr. Thompson's care. The tiny puppy's chest still heaved with effort, but his color was improving. Shadow lay beside the makeshift incubator, her muzzle pressed against the clear plastic, eyes never leaving her struggling offspring. "Look at her," Frank said softly. "She knows exactly what's happening. She understands." As if confirming his words, Shadow turned to look at Frank, then deliberately walked to the window, pawing at the glass and whining. "What is it, girl?" Frank joined her, peering through the snow-streaked window. At first, he saw nothing but the blinding white of the storm. Then, a movement caught his eye. A black SUV struggling through the hospital parking lot, its wheels spinning in the deep snow. "Someone's trying to leave," he noted. "In this weather?" Michael joined him at the window, eyes narrowing. "That's Montgomery's vehicle. I recognize the custom grille." They watched as the SUV finally gained traction and disappeared into the swirling snow, heading in the direction of Montgomery's estate outside town. "Why risk driving in this?" Frank wondered aloud. "The roads are nearly impassable." Michael's expression darkened. "Unless he's removing evidence. Dad, if he knows we have that thumb drive..." The implications hung in the air. Montgomery would be desperate to eliminate anything connecting him to animal abuse or Eleanor's death before authorities could obtain a warrant. "We need to get to his research facility," Frank decided. "Now, while he's distracted..." "Are you insane?" Michael stared at his father. "It's a whiteout. The roads are closed, and you're recovering from a heart attack." "Which is why no one will expect it," Frank countered. "Montgomery's facility is on the old logging road less than 5 miles from here. I spent 40 years hunting these woods. I know every back trail. It's still trespassing, potentially breaking and entering." "Then don't come," Frank interrupted. "I'll go alone." "Like hell you will," Michael snapped, the professional officer momentarily replaced by the son. "You'll die out there." Their argument was interrupted by Martha. "Boys," she said sharply, reminding Frank of how she'd broken up neighborhood disputes decades ago. "Neither of you is going anywhere in this storm." Dr. Thompson joined them, her expression grim. "Scout's stabilizing, but he needs specialized medication I don't have here. The only supply locally would be at Montgomery's research facility." Frank looked at his son. "Still think we shouldn't go?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, conflicted. "This is insane. Even if we could reach the facility, it'll be secured. Probably alarmed." "Not with the power out," Frank pointed out. "They'll be on backup generators, just like the hospital, limited security systems." Martha cleared her throat. "If you two idiots are determined to get yourselves killed, you should know there's a service tunnel that connects the hospital to Montgomery's research building." Everyone turned to stare at her. "What? I worked here 40 years. The tunnel was built during the Cold War, emergency evacuation route. Connects to what used to be the old sanatorium before Montgomery converted it." "And you know how to access this tunnel?" Michael asked incredulously. Martha sniffed. "Of course I do. Head of nursing had keys to everything. They never asked for them back when I retired." Frank looked at Shadow, who had returned to Scout's side, but watched their conversation with evident interest. "What do you think, girl? Ready to go home and raise a little hell?" Shadow's ears perked up, her intelligent eyes fixed on Frank with what could only be described as determination. The decision made, they moved quickly. James agreed to monitor Scout, with Dr. Thompson providing specific instructions. Martha produced a set of ancient keys from her purse and a hand-drawn map of the tunnel system. "This is against every protocol and probably several laws," Michael muttered as he checked his service weapon and radioed Sheriff Hayes with a carefully worded message about investigating a lead. Frank, meanwhile, found his clothes in the hospital room closet. His body protested as he changed out of the hospital gown, pain medication wearing off and his chest still tender from the heart attack. But determination drove him forward. For Eleanor, for Shadow, for the truth. Dr. Thompson provided Frank with emergency heart medication and precise instructions. "If you feel any chest pain, shortness of breath, or dizziness, you take this immediately and get back here. Understand?" Frank nodded, though they both knew he had no intention of turning back once started. Martha hugged both men fiercely. "Your mother would be proud," she told Michael. "And terrified," she added to Frank. "Be careful, you stubborn old goat." Shadow stood at attention, sensing the mission ahead. Frank knelt beside her despite his protesting joints. "We're going to make this right," he promised, stroking her scarred head. "For you and your puppies. For Eleanor." As they prepared to leave, the hospital room door opened unexpectedly. Sheriff Hayes entered, snow melting on his heavy coat, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation upon seeing their obvious preparations. "Figured you'd try something stupid," he said to Frank, then nodded to Michael. "Officer Davis." Michael straightened. "Sir, I can explain." Hayes held up a hand. "Save it. I know about the tunnel from the old bomb shelter days, and I know about the thumb drive." He looked at Frank. "Martha called me, showed me the files." Frank waited, uncertain whether Hayes was there to stop them or join them. The sheriff sighed heavily. "I've known Richard Montgomery was dirty for years. Could never prove it. Too much money, too much influence." He removed his service weapon, checking it methodically. "But Eleanor Miller was my friend too. If there's even a chance he was involved in her death..." Relief washed over Frank. "You're coming with us?" "Someone's got to make sure whatever evidence you find is legally admissible." Hayes grimaced. "Besides, that bastard's had this coming for a long time." With the sheriff's unexpected support, their plan gained legitimacy. Hayes radioed dispatch, reporting that he and Officer Davis were conducting a welfare check at Montgomery's research facility due to power concerns during the emergency. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Frank felt a strange calm settle over him. For 5 years he'd been a ghost in his own life, going through motions without purpose. Now, with Shadow at his side and his son beside him, he finally had something worth fighting for again. The service tunnel was exactly as Martha had described: narrow, dimly lit by emergency lights, and smelling of damp concrete. The four of them moved in single file, Hayes leading, then Michael, Frank, and Shadow bringing up the rear, her nails clicking softly on the concrete floor. "Montgomery has no idea what's coming for him," Frank thought grimly as they advanced through the darkness, Shadow's reassuring presence at his side giving him strength he hadn't felt in years. The service tunnel stretched beneath Oak Ridge like a concrete artery, dimly lit by emergency bulbs that cast long shadows across their path. Water dripped from the ceiling, creating small puddles that reflected their silhouettes as they moved forward. Sheriff Hayes led with his flashlight. Michael followed with his service weapon at the ready, while Frank and Shadow brought up the rear. Frank's chest tightened with each step, not from his heart condition, but from mounting anxiety. The walls seemed to close in, reminding him of the tunnels in Vietnam where he'd seen friends die. He pressed a hand against the cold concrete to steady himself, focusing on Shadow's warm presence beside him. "You okay, Dad?" Michael glanced back, noticing his father's distress. Frank nodded tightly. "Just keep moving." After 20 minutes of careful progress, they reached a heavy metal door marked with faded civil defense signage. Hayes examined the lock. "Still intact, but hasn't been used in years." He turned to Frank. "Martha said there's a key?" Frank produced the ancient key Martha had pressed into his palm before they left. It turned with difficulty, the mechanism groaning in protest. The door swung open to reveal a stairwell leading upward. "According to the map," Frank said, consulting Martha's hand-drawn guide, "this leads to the old sanatorium basement. Montgomery converted the building into his research facility 5 years ago. Right when he came to town," Michael noted. "Right when Mom died." The coincidence hung in the air between them, adding fuel to their determination. They ascended slowly, mindful of noise. Shadow moved with surprising stealth for her size, ears constantly pivoting to catch any sound. The stairwell ended at another door, this one newer and equipped with a modern lock. Hayes examined it. Electronic keypad, but it's offline, must be on backup power only. He tried the handle, expecting resistance, but to their surprise it turned easily. "Someone's been through here recently," Michael whispered. "Recently enough they didn't bother relocking it." They entered a dimly lit utility room filled with maintenance equipment. A low hum indicated generator power. Beyond another door they could hear the faint sound of voices. Hayes motioned for silence, then carefully eased the door open a crack. Beyond lay a laboratory space bathed in the glow of emergency lighting. White-coated technicians moved with urgency, packing equipment and files into crates while armed security personnel supervised. "They're clearing out," Hayes murmured. "Destroying evidence." Frank peered around the sheriff's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Along one wall stood a row of kennels, most empty but 3 still occupied by German shepherds similar to Shadow. The dogs lay listlessly on metal floors, monitoring equipment attached to their bodies. Shadow growled softly, her body tensing as she caught the scent of her fellow captives. Frank placed a calming hand on her back. "We need a distraction," Michael whispered. "There are at least 6 security guards, all armed." Before they could formulate a plan, alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. Red emergency lights began flashing, and a computerized voice announced, "Security breach detected. All personnel evacuate immediately." "Someone else is here," Hayes realized, drawing his weapon. "This isn't us." The laboratory erupted into controlled chaos. Security guards moved to predetermined positions while technicians accelerated their packing efforts. Through the confusion, Frank spotted a familiar figure entering from the main corridor. Richard Montgomery himself, impeccably dressed despite the emergency, barking orders as he surveyed the evacuation progress. "Get those files loaded now, and the test subjects. Tranquilize and transport the primary assets. Terminate the secondaries." Frank's blood ran cold as a technician moved toward the kenneled dogs with a syringe. Without thinking, he pushed past Hayes and burst through the door. "Stop!" All activity in the lab froze. Security guards swung their weapons toward the intrusion, but hesitated at the sight of Sheriff Hayes and Officer Davis following Frank into the room, their badges clearly visible. Montgomery recovered quickly, his aristocratic features arranging themselves into a mask of outraged innocence. "Sheriff Hayes, what is the meaning of this invasion of private property during an emergency evacuation?" Hayes stepped forward, official and calm. "Mr. Montgomery, we're conducting a welfare check due to the severe weather conditions and power outage. County emergency protocols." Montgomery's eyes narrowed as he spotted Shadow beside Frank. "I see you've brought my property with you. How convenient." "She's not your property," Frank growled, "and neither are those dogs you're about to terminate." Montgomery sighed with theatrical patience. "Mr. Miller, these are research animals that unfortunately failed to meet program standards. Humane euthanasia is standard protocol in medical research." "Is that what you call it?" Frank's voice shook with anger. "The same humane treatment you documented in these?" He held up a flash drive, a duplicate Martha had made of the thumb drive contents. A flicker of alarm crossed Montgomery's face before his composure returned. "I don't know what you think you have there, but any research data is proprietary and classified." "Including data on forcing dogs to continue testing while injured?" Frank challenged. "Or using experimental drugs without proper approval? Or maybe the file marked E." Miller terminated as just standard business too? At the mention of Eleanor's name, Montgomery's mask slipped momentarily. His eyes darted to the nearest security guard, a subtle signal passing between them. Michael noticed the exchange and shifted his position, placing himself between the guard and his father. "Mr. Montgomery, we have reason to believe crimes have been committed at this facility, including animal cruelty, unauthorized medical experimentation, and potentially—" He hesitated, glancing at Frank. Obstruction of justice related to the death of Eleanor Miller. Montgomery's laugh was cold. Preposterous. Mrs. Miller died in a tragic accident years ago. Are you suggesting I had something to do with that? Based on what? Some misinterpreted research notes? A grieving husband's conspiracy theories? Before anyone could respond, the laboratory doors burst open again. Two uniformed state police officers entered, followed by a woman in a dark suit who displayed federal credentials. "Richard Montgomery," the woman announced crisply. "I'm Special Agent Catherine Ward, FBI. This facility is now under federal jurisdiction as part of an ongoing investigation into illegal animal testing and corporate fraud." Montgomery's composed facade cracked completely. "This is outrageous. I have government contracts, powerful friends in Washington, who are currently distancing themselves from you quite rapidly," Agent Ward replied coldly, "especially after receiving evidence of your unauthorized continuation of Project Sentinel after congressional termination." Frank exchanged confused glances with Hayes and Michael. None of them had contacted federal authorities. As if reading their thoughts, Agent Ward nodded toward the kenneled dogs. "We've been building a case against Montgomery for months. One of his own researchers turned whistleblower after witnessing the treatment of the test subjects." While Montgomery was engaged with the federal agents, Frank moved slowly toward the kenneled dogs. The technician who had been preparing to euthanize them stood frozen, syringe still in hand. Frank fixed him with a hard stare. "Put that down and step away." The young man hesitated, looking toward Montgomery for direction. "Now," Frank added quietly, "before I let her show you how she feels about what you've done to her friends." He nodded toward Shadow, whose hackles were raised, her focus locked on the technician. The man carefully set down the syringe and backed away. Frank examined the caged dogs, his heart breaking at their condition. Unlike Shadow, who had somehow maintained her spirit despite the abuse, these animals showed signs of having been broken. Dull eyes, defensive postures, multiple healing wounds. He reached for the nearest cage latch. "Sir, please don't open those," Agent Ward called out. "Those animals may be unstable or dangerous." Frank ignored her, swinging the cage door open. The German shepherd inside cowered at the back of the kennel, trembling violently. Shadow moved forward slowly, stopping at Frank's side. The two dogs regarded each other, one broken, one resilient. After a tense moment, Shadow gave a soft whine, her tail moving in a cautious wag. The kenneled dog's ears perked slightly, the first sign of normal dog behavior. "They need medical attention," Frank told Agent Ward without looking away from the dogs. "Dr. Sarah Thompson at the Oak Ridge Veterinary Clinic can help." As federal agents secured the laboratory and began documenting evidence, Frank became aware of a commotion near the main entrance. Montgomery was being handcuffed, his protests growing increasingly desperate. "This is all a misunderstanding. Those files are being taken out of context. Miller has a personal vendetta against me." Sheriff Hayes approached Frank, keeping his voice low. "This is bigger than we thought. Federal case means it'll be handled properly, but Eleanor's death might get lost in the larger investigation," Frank finished, understanding the sheriff's concern. "Not necessarily," came Michael's voice as he joined them. "Agent Ward says they've been investigating Montgomery for months. They have evidence connecting him to multiple incidents, including, potentially, Mom's accident." Frank's heart lurched. "What kind of evidence?" "They wouldn't specify yet, but—" Michael was interrupted by Shadow's sudden, alert posture. The dog had frozen, her attention fixed on the far end of the laboratory, where a door marked "Restricted Access" stood partially open. Without warning, Shadow bolted toward the door, slipping through before anyone could stop her. "Shadow!" Frank called, following as quickly as his weakened body would allow. Michael and Hayes were close behind. Beyond the door lay a smaller, more specialized laboratory space. Unlike the main area, this room contained medical equipment more suited to human patients than animals, examination tables, monitoring devices, and pharmaceutical supplies. Shadow stood in the center, barking at a wall-mounted safe that had been left open and partially emptied. "What is this place?" Michael wondered aloud, surveying the strange hybrid of veterinary and human medical equipment. Frank approached the safe, examining the remaining contents, vials of medication, research notes, and a single USB drive labeled Phase 2, Human Trials. They weren't just experimenting on dogs, Frank realized with growing horror. They were preparing to move to human subjects. Sheriff Hayes picked up a logbook from a nearby desk, flipping through pages of entries. These are records of preliminary human exposure dating back 3 years. They were already testing whatever compounds they developed on people. "Willing subjects?" Michael asked. Hayes's expression darkened. "Some entries are coded as informed consent. Others are marked uninformed observation." The implications were chilling. Montgomery hadn't just been developing enhanced detection capabilities in dogs. He'd been preparing to extend those enhancements to humans, with or without their knowledge. Shadow whined, pawing at the safe. Frank looked closer and noticed a folder partially hidden behind the vials. He carefully extracted it, finding medical records inside labeled with familiar names. Hospital patients, all from Oak Ridge. They were using the hospital connection to identify potential test subjects, Frank said grimly. Montgomery's wing gave them access to patient data. As they processed this discovery, Agent Ward entered the restricted lab. "Mr. Miller, I need you to step away from that evidence." Frank turned, still holding the folder. "These are medical records of people from my town. People who had no idea they were being experimented on." "We're aware of the scope of Mr. Montgomery's activities," Ward replied, her tone softening slightly. "That's why this investigation has federal priority." "And my wife, Eleanor Miller? Was she one of his uninformed observations too?" Agent Ward hesitated. "Mr. Miller, I can't discuss specifics of an ongoing investigation, but—" She glanced at Michael, then continued, "We have evidence suggesting Mrs. Miller discovered the unauthorized human testing. She was preparing documentation for state medical authorities when her accident occurred." "It wasn't an accident," Frank stated flatly. "No," Agent Ward confirmed quietly. "We don't believe it was." The admission hit Frank like a physical blow. After 5 years of accepting the official explanation, hearing his suspicions confirmed reopened the wound of Eleanor's death. His legs weakened, and he reached for the edge of a desk to steady himself. Michael moved to his father's side, supporting him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Dad, you need to sit down. Your heart—" "I'm fine," Frank insisted, though the room had begun to spin slightly. He fumbled in his pocket for the medication Dr. Thompson had provided. Shadow returned to Frank's side, pressing against his leg as if sensing his distress. Her steady presence anchored him as he digested the truth about Eleanor's death. "Montgomery will pay for this," Michael promised, the professional officer momentarily overshadowed by the son seeking justice for his mother. As federal agents continued securing evidence, Frank found himself growing increasingly lightheaded. The stress of the confrontation, combined with his recent heart attack and the emotional toll of learning the truth about Eleanor, proved too much for his weakened system. "Dad?" Michael's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Dad, your color doesn't look good." Frank tried to respond but found he couldn't form words. A crushing pressure spread across his chest, and the edges of his vision darkened. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Shadow's concerned face and his son's panicked expression as he lowered Frank to the floor. "We need medical assistance now!" Michael shouted. his voice echoing strangely in Frank's fading awareness. "My father's having another heart attack." Darkness enveloped Frank as Shadow's urgent barking faded into silence. His last coherent thought was of Eleanor, her smile, her voice, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day. "I'm coming, Ellie," he thought as consciousness slipped away entirely. "I'm finally coming home." Darkness swirled around Frank, punctuated by fleeting images of Eleanor smiling in their garden, Robert as a boy catching his first fish, the way sunlight had danced across Shadow's fur when he first cut her free from those railway tracks. These visions flowed together like water, the boundaries between memories dissolving as his consciousness ebbed. He felt light, unburdened, as if the years of grief and loneliness were falling away. "Frank? Frank, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from very far away. Frank tried to ignore it, drawn instead toward a warm light where he sensed Eleanor waiting. "Dad, stay with us!" The desperate plea in his son's voice tugged at him, pulling him back from the brink. Frank became aware of pressure on his chest, the sharp sting of medication entering his arm, and the rhythmic compression of CPR. "We've got a pulse. It's weak, but steady." Consciousness returned in fragments. The cold floor beneath him, urgent voices, the antiseptic smell of the laboratory. Most distinctly, he felt the warmth of Shadow pressed against his side, her soft whine cutting through the commotion around him. Frank's eyes fluttered open to find Michael leaning over him, face etched with fear. Behind him stood Dr. Thompson, who must have been summoned from the hospital, administering an injection into his IV line. "You're back," Michael whispered, relief washing over his features. "We thought we'd lost you." Frank tried to speak but found his mouth dry, his words trapped. Shadow nudged his hand with her nose, her amber eyes fixed on his face with such intensity that it seemed she was willing him to live through sheer determination. "The ambulance can't get through because of the storm," Dr. Thompson explained, checking his pulse. "But we've stabilized you for now. Sheriff Hayes is arranging transport back to the hospital through the tunnel." Frank's gaze drifted past them to where federal agents continued documenting evidence. Montgomery was nowhere to be seen, presumably already taken into custody. One of the agents, a younger woman with kind eyes, approached cautiously. "Mr. Miller, I'm Agent Ramirez. I know this isn't ideal timing, but while we wait for transport, I was hoping you might identify something for us." Despite Dr. Thompson's protests, the agent held up a photograph, a faded Polaroid showing a much younger Eleanor in scrubs, smiling as she held a German Shepherd puppy. The dog's distinctive markings were unmistakable. "Is this your wife?" Agent Ramirez asked gently. "And do you recognize the dog?" Frank stared at the image, his heart constricting with recognition. "That's Eleanor," he confirmed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "And that puppy, those markings, we believe it's Shadow," the agent finished. This photo was taken 7 years ago at the original research facility where Montgomery's program began. According to records we've uncovered, your wife Eleanor was briefly employed there as a part-time nurse before the program moved to Oak Ridge. Frank's mind raced despite his weakened state. Eleanor never mentioned working with research animals. "She signed extensive non-disclosure agreements," Agent Ramirez explained. "But our whistleblower claims she became attached to this particular puppy, even named her Luna according to unofficial notes." The revelation struck Frank like lightning. Luna. The name had seemed so natural when he'd first encountered Shadow on those train tracks, as if it had come from some deep subconscious place. Had Eleanor mentioned the puppy in passing years ago? Had he somehow retained that memory without realizing it? "Shadow recognized me," Frank realized aloud. "Not just as someone helping her, but she knew who I was." "We believe so," Agent Ramirez nodded. "Dogs have exceptional olfactory memory. If she associated your scent with Eleanor, with safety—" "She came full circle," Michael said quietly. "From Mom to you." The coincidence seemed too perfect to be mere chance, yet the alternative, that Eleanor had somehow guided this connection from beyond, felt too mystical for Frank's practical mind. Whatever the explanation, the bond between him and Shadow suddenly carried even deeper meaning. As they prepared to transport Frank back to the hospital, Agent Ward returned, her expression serious. "We've completed an initial sweep of Montgomery's office. There's something you should see." Despite medical objections, Frank insisted on viewing what they'd found. Supported by Michael and with Shadow at his side, he was escorted to Montgomery's private office, an opulent space with mahogany paneling and leather furniture that stood in stark contrast to the sterile laboratory. On Montgomery's desk lay an open ledger flagged by federal investigators. The page showed a list of names with dates and notations, people whose accidents had been arranged when they threatened Montgomery's operations. Eleanor's name was third on the list, the notation beside it reading simply, "River Road Brake Line Completed." Frank stared at the damning evidence, emotions warring within him. Vindication that his suspicions had been confirmed, rage at the calculated murder of his beloved wife, and a profound grief freshly awakened after 5 years of numbness. "He kept records," Frank said incredulously, "of the people he killed." "Sociopaths often do," Agent Ward replied. "They see their crimes as achievements, not something to hide." She hesitated before adding, "Montgomery didn't expect to be caught. The arrogance of wealthy men like him makes them believe they're untouchable." Sheriff Hayes, who had been coordinating with emergency services, joined them. "Transport's ready. We need to get Frank back to the hospital before this storm gets any worse." As they prepared to leave, Shadow suddenly stiffened, her attention fixed on a seemingly ordinary bookshelf. She approached it cautiously, sniffing along the base before pawing insistently at a specific spot. "She's alerting to something," Dr. Thompson observed. Sheriff Hayes examined the bookshelf, running his fingers along the wood until he found a nearly invisible seam. With careful pressure, a hidden compartment popped open, revealing a stack of files and a small fireproof safe. "More evidence they were trying to destroy," Agent Ward said, carefully removing the documents. "Financial records, offshore accounts." She paused, extracting a USB drive labeled contingency. While the agents documented this new evidence, Frank's strength began to wane again. The adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, leaving him dangerously weak. Dr. Thompson insisted they delay no longer, and the group began their journey back through the service tunnel. Shadow led the way, seemingly understanding the urgency of getting Frank to safety. Despite her own traumatic history in this facility, she moved with purpose, occasionally looking back as if to ensure Frank was still following. Halfway through the tunnel, Frank's legs gave out. Michael caught him before he could fall, supporting his father's weight against his shoulder. "Just a little further, Dad," he encouraged. "Stay with me." Frank nodded weakly, each step requiring monumental effort. The pain in his chest had returned, a tight band constricting his breathing. But something beyond physical strength drove him forward. The knowledge that Eleanor's killer would face justice, that Shadow and her puppies were safe, and most surprisingly, that his son had returned to his life. "I never thought I'd see you again," Frank admitted, his voice barely audible over their echoing footsteps. "After our fight, when you left." Michael's jaw tightened with emotion. "I was stubborn, angry. I thought I had all the time in the world to make things right someday." "Eleanor's death taught me how quickly someday can disappear," Frank replied. They continued in silence, each man lost in regrets for the years wasted in estrangement. When they finally reached the hospital end of the tunnel, Martha was waiting with a medical team. She rushed forward at the sight of Frank's pallor. "You foolish, brave old man," she scolded, tears in her eyes as they transferred him to a gurney. "I told you not to overdo it. Frank managed a weak smile. Had to see it through, Martha. For Eleanor. As they wheeled him toward the elevator, Frank's hand reached out for Shadow, who pressed her muzzle into his palm. "Stay with the puppies," he whispered to her. "I'll be back." Shadow whined softly, reluctant to leave his side, but Martha gently took her leash. "She'll be with Scout," she promised, "right next door to your room." The following hours passed in a blur of medical interventions. Frank's second heart attack had caused additional damage, requiring intensive treatment. He drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Michael's constant presence in a chair beside his bed, of doctors and nurses working to stabilize his condition, of Martha's voice reading aloud from his favorite Hemingway novel during the long night hours. Sometime during the third day, Frank awoke with greater clarity. The storm had finally passed, weak winter sunlight filtering through his window. Michael dozed in the visitor's chair, his uniform replaced by casual clothes, his face showing the strain of sleepless nights. "Robert," Frank called softly, deliberately using his son's birth name. Michael stirred, instantly alert. "Dad, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," Frank admitted. "But I'm still here." Michael leaned forward, relief evident in his tired eyes. "The doctors say you're stabilizing." It was touch and go for a while. Frank nodded, taking stock of the various monitors and IV lines connected to his body. "Montgomery?" "In federal custody. No bail. They're still going through the evidence, but with the hidden ledger and the whistleblower's testimony, he's facing multiple charges including murder, corporate fraud, animal cruelty, and illegal human experimentation." "Good." Frank paused, gathering his strength. "Shadow? The puppies?" At this, Michael smiled. "Scout's improving." "Doctor?" "Thompson says it's remarkable, given how sick he was. The medication they found at Montgomery's facility helped. Ironic that the same research that hurt Shadow ended up saving her puppy. And Shadow herself. Splitting her time between your room, when the nurses allow it, and the makeshift kennel they've set up for the puppies in the unused physical therapy room down the hall. The other dogs from the facility are there too, receiving treatment." Frank closed his eyes briefly, picturing Shadow watching over her puppies, finally safe. When he opened them again, he found Michael studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "There's something else you should know," his son said hesitantly. "We found Eleanor's personal journal in Montgomery's office safe. He kept it as insurance, I guess. Knowledge of what she knew." Michael swallowed hard. "She wrote about you, Dad." "About how much she loved you, how worried she was about leaving you alone if anything happened to her." Tears welled in Frank's eyes. "She knew she was in danger." "She suspected it," Michael confirmed, "but she couldn't walk away from what she'd discovered. There's also entries about me." His voice cracked slightly. "About how much she missed me, how she hoped someday I'd come home and make peace with you." The weight of lost years hung between them, years when they could have been a family, supporting each other through Eleanor's death instead of suffering separately. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered, "for everything I said that day. I was wrong." Michael shook his head. "We both were. I was young and arrogant, thought I knew everything." He hesitated, then added, "Emma's been asking about you, wants to meet her grandfather." "I'd like that," Frank said, his heart lightening at the thought of his granddaughter. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway, excited voices, a child's laughter, and the distinctive sound of dog nails on linoleum. Before either man could react, the door burst open and a small whirlwind, in the form of a 7-year-old girl with Eleanor's eyes, rushed in, followed by Shadow and Martha, who offered an apologetic shrug. "She couldn't wait any longer," Martha explained, "and neither could Shadow." Emma stopped at the foot of Frank's bed, suddenly shy in the presence of the grandfather she'd only known from photographs. Shadow, however, had no such hesitation. She moved immediately to Frank's side, resting her head gently on the edge of the bed, her expressive eyes conveying what seemed like relief at finding him alive. "Is this your dog, Grandpa?" Emma asked, her voice small but curious. Frank smiled, reaching out to stroke Shadow's head. "This is Shadow. She saved my life." Emma approached cautiously. "Daddy says she's a hero dog." "That she can tell when people are sick." "That's right," Frank confirmed. "She's very special." The little girl reached out to pet Shadow, who accepted the attention with dignified patience. "She looks like she has stories to tell," Emma observed with the simple wisdom of children. "She does," Frank agreed. "Maybe someday I'll tell you all of them." As Emma chatted excitedly about the puppies she'd just visited, Frank watched his son's face soften with love for his daughter. In that moment, despite his weakened state and the tubes connecting him to machines, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. The warmth of family, the sense of belonging that had disappeared with Eleanor's death. Shadow seemed to sense this shift, her tail wagging gently as she looked between Frank, Michael, and Emma. Against all odds, she had brought them together. This extraordinary dog who had suffered so much yet retained her capacity for loyalty and love. Later that evening, when Emma had been taken home and Michael had stepped out to make calls, Martha sat beside Frank's bed, Shadow still faithfully at his side. "You know," Martha said thoughtfully, "some people might call all this coincidence. Shadow finding her way to you, the connection to Eleanor, you and Robert reconciling. But I don't believe in coincidences that big." Frank stroked Shadow's soft ears, considering Martha's words. "What do you believe in, then?" Martha smiled, her weathered face gentle in the evening light. "I believe Eleanor's still looking out for you. And I believe this dog was meant to find you, to save you in more ways than one." Frank wasn't sure what he believed anymore. The practical, logical part of him resisted such mystical thinking. But as Shadow rested her head on his hand, her amber eyes watching him with what could only be described as devotion, he couldn't deny the extraordinary chain of events that had led them to each other. "Maybe you're right," he conceded. "All I know is I'm not alone anymore." Outside his window, the first stars appeared in the clearing sky. The worst of winter had passed, both literally and figuratively. There would be challenges ahead: his recovery, Montgomery's trial, helping Shadow and the other dogs heal from their trauma. But for the first time since losing Eleanor, Frank Miller faced the future with something that had long been missing from his life: hope. Spring came early to Oak Ridge that year. As March gave way to April, the last patches of snow melted from Frank's yard, revealing the first green shoots of Eleanor's perennial garden pushing through the dark soil. From his porch rocker, Frank watched Shadow patrol the property line, her movements strong and purposeful, so different from the traumatized dog he'd found on those railway tracks 3 months earlier. "She's looking good," Martha observed, settling into the adjacent chair with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Frank, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You both are." Frank touched his chest unconsciously. The double heart attack had forced significant changes in his life: a strict diet, daily medication, supervised exercise at the rehabilitation center. But for the first time in years, he had reasons to follow doctor's orders, to fight for more time. "Cardiac rehab went well this morning," he reported. "Doctor Sanderson says my numbers are improving." Martha smiled. Miracles never cease. Frank Miller, voluntarily going to the doctor. He chuckled, watching as Shadow suddenly sprinted toward the driveway where Michael's police cruiser appeared, gravel crunching beneath its tires. Emma's excited face pressed against the passenger window, her hand waving frantically. Shadow's tail wagged in greeting as the car stopped. "Grandpa?" Emma called, tumbling out of the vehicle with the boundless energy of 7-year-olds. She raced toward the porch, her dark hair, Eleanor's hair, streaming behind her. "Did you get my drawing for your refrigerator?" "I sure did," Frank confirmed, warming at the simple joy of being called Grandpa. "It's got the place of honor right next to the microwave." Emma beamed, then turned her attention to Shadow. "Is Scout here? Can I see him?" "He's inside with his brother and sister," Frank told her. "Growing bigger every day." As Emma darted into the house, Michael approached the porch more slowly, carrying a folder under his arm. The past months had seen a careful rebuilding of their relationship, not erasing 15 years of estrangement, but creating something new from the ashes of their past conflict. "Sheriff Hayes sent these over," Michael said, handing the folder to Frank. "Thought you'd want to see them before the hearing tomorrow." Frank opened the folder to find photographs of Montgomery's now shuttered research facility. Federal agents had completed their investigation, cataloging evidence for what had become one of the largest cases of corporate fraud and criminal conspiracy in the state's history. "They're demolishing it next month," Michael added. "Town council voted to turn the land into a public park." "Good," Frank said firmly. "That place has seen enough suffering." Martha excused herself to check on Emma and the puppies, leaving father and son alone on the porch. Michael settled into her vacant chair, his uniform crisp but his posture relaxed, a change from the stiff formality that had marked their early reunions. "How's Laura handling everything?" Frank asked, referring to Michael's ex-wife. Michael sighed. "Better. Having Emma visit you regularly has actually helped. She sees that family connections matter, even after divorce." He hesitated. "She's agreed to let Emma stay with me every weekend now, not just every other." "That's progress," Frank acknowledged, remembering how bitter the custody arrangement had been initially. Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's reappearance, Scout trotting faithfully at her heels. The once sickly puppy had grown into a handsome young dog, slightly smaller than his siblings, but with a brightness in his eyes that reflected his fighting spirit. "Grandpa, can Scout come to my soccer game Saturday?" Emma asked, her arm draped around the young dog's neck. "He's the best luck ever." Frank exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded. "I don't see why not. Shadow might want to come too." "The whole dog family?" Emma exclaimed delightedly before racing back inside, Scout following closely. Michael smiled. "She's got them all wrapped around her finger. Even Lady, and she doesn't warm up to just anyone." Unlike his brother Scout and sister Lady, who had found their permanent homes with Frank and Martha respectively, Ranger had been adopted by Sheriff Hayes, who had recognized the dog's protective instincts and begun training him for potential police work. The three puppies still had regular reunions with their mother at Frank's house, gatherings that had become community events as the story of their rescue spread. "The prosecutor called this morning," Michael said, lowering his voice to ensure Emma couldn't overhear. "Montgomery's attorneys are pushing for a plea deal." Frank's jaw tightened. "After everything he did, to Eleanor, to those dogs, to who knows how many others? They're claiming diminished capacity, saying his obsession with the research program affected his judgment." Michael's tone made clear his own opinion of this defense, but the prosecutor won't accept anything less than full accountability for Mom's death. "That's non-negotiable." Frank nodded, grateful. The federal case against Montgomery had expanded far beyond animal cruelty into corporate fraud, illegal human testing, and multiple counts of murder or manslaughter. Eleanor's death was just one of several accidents arranged to silence potential whistleblowers. "Will you be at the hearing tomorrow?" Michael asked. "Wouldn't miss it," Frank confirmed. "Dr. Thompson's picking me up." "Shadow, too. She deserves to see that bastard face justice." As if summoned by her name, Shadow appeared from around the house, pausing to shake off dirt from what Frank suspected was another excavation of Eleanor's garden. The dog had developed a curious habit of digging in one particular corner, though she never disturbed the plantings themselves. "Still hunting treasure?" Frank called to her affectionately. Shadow trotted up the porch steps, settling at his feet with a contented sigh. Her recovery had been remarkable. Physically, her coat now gleamed with health, the old scars still visible but faded beneath new growth. Emotionally, she had gradually transformed from the wary, traumatized animal on those railway tracks to a confident, affectionate companion who seemed to understand her role in Frank's healing just as surely as he understood his and hers. The following morning dawned clear and mild. Frank, dressed carefully in his best suit, the one he had worn to Eleanor's funeral, now altered to fit his thinner frame. Dr. Thompson arrived promptly at 9, her small SUV already containing Martha and a specially groomed Shadow wearing a blue service dog vest. "Is that official?" Frank asked, gesturing to the vest as he climbed into the passenger seat. Dr. Thompson smiled. "As of yesterday, Shadow passed her therapy dog certification with flying colors. The judge agreed she could attend today as your official support animal." The courthouse in Portland buzzed with activity when they arrived. The Montgomery case had attracted national attention, with reporters clustered around the entrance and protesters holding signs demanding justice for both human and animal victims. Inside, they found Michael and Sheriff Hayes waiting in the designated witness area. The preliminary hearing would determine whether Montgomery's case would proceed to full trial or be resolved through a plea agreement. Frank had been called to testify about finding Shadow and her puppies, as well as his connection to Eleanor's involvement with Montgomery's research. As they waited, Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not his heart condition this time, but anxiety at the thought of facing his wife's killer across the courtroom. Shadow sensed his distress immediately, pressing against his leg and looking up with steady amber eyes that seemed to say, "I'm here." "She always knows," Martha remarked, watching their interaction. "It's like she can read your mind." "Not my mind," Frank corrected, reaching down to stroke Shadow's head. "My heart." The bailiff called them into courtroom 3, where Judge Patricia Simmons presided. Frank had met her briefly during the initial proceedings and had been impressed by her no-nonsense approach and evident compassion for the victims. The courtroom fell silent as Richard Montgomery was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his customary tailored suits. 3 months in federal detention had diminished his commanding presence. His shoulders slumped, his formerly impeccable silver hair now dull and unkempt. He kept his eyes downcast, avoiding the stares of those he had wronged. Shadow's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her body stiffened, a low growl rumbling in her throat as she fixed her gaze on Montgomery. Frank placed a calming hand on her back, whispering reassurance. "It's okay, girl. He can't hurt anyone anymore." The proceedings began with formal statements from both prosecution and defense. Montgomery's attorney, an expensive Washington lawyer named Harrington, presented his client as a brilliant researcher whose dedication to scientific advancement had regrettably clouded his ethical judgment. The prosecutor, District Attorney Elena Vasquez, countered with a devastating summary of evidence. The ledger documenting eliminated whistleblowers, financial records showing millions diverted from legitimate research to unauthorized experiments, testimony from former employees about Montgomery's direct orders to silence threats by any means necessary. When it came time for victim statements, Frank approached the podium with Shadow at his side. Looking directly at Montgomery, who still refused to raise his eyes, Frank spoke clearly into the microphone. 5 years ago, my wife Eleanor discovered what Richard Montgomery was doing. She was preparing to report his illegal activities when she died in what we were told was a tragic accident. For 5 years, I lived with grief and unanswered questions. Then this past winter, I found Shadow and her puppies tied to railroad tracks during a blizzard, another accident Montgomery had arranged to eliminate evidence of his crimes. Frank paused, gathering his emotions before continuing. Eleanor was a nurse. She dedicated her life to healing, to relieving suffering. When she found out animals and eventually humans were being harmed in Montgomery's experiments, she couldn't look the other way. She died because she had the courage to stand up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He looked down at Shadow, whose steady presence gave him strength to continue. This dog survived unimaginable cruelty. She was treated as property, as a tool, not as the extraordinary living being she is. Despite everything humans did to her, she still chose to trust again, to save lives, including mine. Her capacity for forgiveness is something Montgomery could never understand. Frank turned back to the judge. Your Honor, there are some crimes so calculated, so heartless, that they demand the fullest measure of justice, not for vengeance, but to affirm that even the wealthiest and most powerful among us are bound by the same moral laws as everyone else. Eleanor believed that. I believe it too. When Frank returned to his seat, Michael squeezed his shoulder wordlessly, eyes bright with emotion. Judge Simmons thanked him for his statement, her own expression grave as she considered his words. After hearing additional testimony from Sheriff Hayes, Dr. Thompson, and the FBI agents who had investigated the case, Judge Simmons called a brief recess to consider the defense's plea offer. The courtroom buzzed with subdued conversation as they waited for her return. Whatever happens, Martha said quietly, Eleanor would be proud of you today. Frank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Shadow rested her head on his knee, her presence a constant comfort. When Judge Simmons returned, her expression revealed her decision before she spoke. Having reviewed the evidence and heard testimony from victims, this court rejects the proposed plea agreement as insufficient given the severity and calculated nature of the defendant's crimes. A murmur ran through the courtroom as she continued. Mr. Montgomery, you will stand trial for all charges as outlined in the indictment, including first-degree murder and the death of Eleanor Miller. This court finds that justice in this case requires full accountability, not the partial admission of guilt your attorneys have proposed. Relief washed over Frank. While a trial would be difficult, it meant Montgomery would not escape with the reduced sentence his lawyers had negotiated. More importantly, Eleanor's death would be recognized for what it was, not an accident, but murder. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them, cameras flashing. Frank had avoided media attention throughout the investigation, but today felt different. With Shadow beside him and Michael, Martha, and Dr. Thompson surrounding him supportively, he faced the microphones. Mr. Miller, how do you feel about the judge's decision? A young reporter called out. Frank considered his answer carefully. Relieved, not just for my wife Eleanor, but for all Montgomery's victims, human and animal. Today is the first step toward justice. And what about Shadow? Another reporter asked, pointing to the German shepherd who stood calmly amid the commotion. Will she testify at the trial? Despite the serious occasion, Frank couldn't suppress a small smile. Shadow has already provided all the testimony needed. Now she's focusing on her new job as a therapy dog, helping others heal from trauma. She's turning her experience into something positive, something we could all learn from. As spring turned to summer, life in Oak Ridge established new rhythms. Montgomery's trial was scheduled for September, but Frank refused to let it dominate his days. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his health, his family connections, his home. With Michael's help, he renovated the long-neglected second bedroom that had become a storage space after climbing stairs became difficult. New handrails, better lighting, and a sturdy bench made the staircase manageable again, allowing Frank to reclaim the entire house. Eleanor's garden flourished under Martha's experienced care, supplemented by Emma's enthusiastic, if sometimes misguided, assistance. The little girl spent every weekend with her father and made Frank's house her second home, filling it with artwork, laughter, and the occasional science experiment. Shadow continued to surprise everyone with her resilience and adaptability. Her therapy dog certification opened new opportunities, visits to the local elementary school, the Veterans Center, and eventually, with Dr. Thompson's careful supervision, the hospital where Eleanor had once worked. One warm June evening, as fireflies began to illuminate the deepening twilight, Frank sat on his porch, watching Emma and Scout chase each other across the lawn. Michael stood at the grill, preparing hamburgers with the serious concentration he applied to all tasks. Martha arranged potato salad and coleslaw on the picnic table, occasionally shouting good-natured corrections to Michael's grilling technique. Shadow lay at Frank's feet, her head resting on her paws as she monitored the activity with contented vigilance. Frank reached down to scratch behind her ears, marveling at how completely his life had transformed in just 6 months. "You know," he said softly to Shadow, "I spent 5 years just existing after Eleanor died, not living, just getting through each day." The dog lifted her head, eyes attentive to his words. "I never thought I'd have this again. Family, purpose, joy even." Shadow's tail thumped against the porch boards in what Frank had come to recognize as her form of agreement. "I think Eleanor would be happy," he continued. "Not just about Montgomery facing justice, but about this," he gestured to the scene before them, "about us finding our way back to living." As if responding to her name, a gentle breeze stirred Eleanor's wind chimes, creating a delicate melody that drifted across the porch. Shadow's ears perked up at the sound, her gaze following something Frank couldn't see. In that moment, with the golden light of sunset illuminating his family and Shadow's comforting presence beside him, Frank felt a sense of peace he had thought lost forever. The journey had been painful, filled with loss, betrayal, and hardship, but it had led him here, to this second chance at happiness. "Come on, you two," Martha called from the picnic table. "Food's getting cold." Frank rose from his rocker, his movements slower than in his youth, but steadier than they'd been in years. Shadow stood with him, ready as always to accompany him wherever he went. "Let's go, girl," he said, his hand resting lightly on her back. "The family's waiting." Together, man and dog descended the porch steps into the warm embrace of a summer evening, moving forward into a future neither could have imagined when they first found each other on those snow-covered railway tracks. A future built on the extraordinary bond between a broken man and the remarkable dog who had saved him in more ways than one. Dear friends, Frank and Shadow's journey reminds us that life's most precious gifts often arrive in unexpected packages. After losing Eleanor, Frank believed his story had ended, but fate had different plans. Like Frank, many of us face chapters we never anticipated: empty nests, retirement, health challenges, or losing those we love. Yet his story shows that even in our winter seasons, spring waits patiently beneath the snow. The courage to open our hearts again, whether to a strange family, new relationships, or even a loyal pet, can transform loneliness into purpose. Frank found healing not by forgetting his past, but by allowing new connections to honor it. Eleanor's memory lived on through his reconciliation with his son, the joy of knowing his granddaughter, and the remarkable bond with a dog who somehow completed a circle Eleanor had begun years before. If you're weathering your own storm right now, remember Frank's journey. Second chances come in many forms. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin precisely when we believe our story is over. Has a special animal ever helped you through a difficult time in your life? When was the last time you reconnected with someone you thought was lost to you forever? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.